The next section is called Jesus Presented in the Temple. Just for context, I'm sure you guys all know this, but Mary and Joseph, Jesus's earthly parents, are Jewish. We gotta remember that at this time, Christianity isn't a thing yet because Jesus established that. At the time of Jesus' birth and life, the Jews had the Old Testament, the scriptures, they were studying them, and they were under the Old Covenant, sometimes referenced as the Law of Moses. And their salvation and ability to get into heaven was kind of based on if you follow these laws, and then if you break any of them, you sacrifice an animal. And now, of course, with Christianity, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament, which we believe is the complete Bible. And we believe that Jesus establishes the New Covenant, which tells us that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice for all of mankind. And our salvation is faith-based. And we see Jesus as a fulfillment of the entire Old Covenant law. Anyways, in verse 22, it talks about purification rites required by the law of Moses. So Jesus goes to Jerusalem to be presented to the Lord, just like the Old Testament laws told him to do. It says, in Jerusalem, there was a man named Simeon who was righteous and the Holy Spirit was on him. It says he was waiting for the consolation of Israel. He was waiting for Israel to be saved by the Messiah. And what's beautiful is that the Holy Spirit told him he wouldn't die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. The Spirit nudged him, hey, go into the temple courts now. And as soon as baby Jesus came in with his parents, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Also for context, Gentiles are anyone who's just not Jewish, which is another little hint that Jesus is not just for the Jews. He's not just for their forgiveness of their sins, but for everyone, Jews and Gentiles. To add to this, in verse 36, there's a prophet named Anna who was a bit older. It says she never left the temple but worshipped day and night, fasting and praying. She also came up to Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus, and she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Then verse 40 says, the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom and the grace of God was on him. Another pretty cool thing is if you go back to Isaiah 11, which I was talking about earlier, in verse 2, it says, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding. Pretty cool. Last thing, it talks about Jesus as a little kid in the temple. It says that Jesus and his family had gone to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. When it was over, they began to go home and they didn't realize that Jesus was still behind in the temple. When they realized, they came back and they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and answers. And of course, when your child goes missing, you're going to be a little bit scared. And whenever Mary talked to him, he said, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Verse 50, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. To close out in verse 52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man.